Spoiler alert for this review. Mega Man X2 is incredible. It is a challenging game while still being accessible, creative while it satisfies the series' traditions, and an artistic feast for the eyes and ears. In this review, I'm going to explain in depth why Mega Man X2 is an incredible game by examining in detail the game's historical context, the controls, the level design, combat and enemy designs, music, and storyline. Before I begin, I do want to issue a serious spoiler alert. I will be discussing the game in its entirety. I'll talk about the game's storyline and many secrets within the gameplay in an attempt to explain why this game is so special. So let's begin with the historical context of Mega Man X2. Mega Man X1 managed to do the impossible. It reimagined a 6-game series in a creative way that satisfied most fans. It was impeccably well designed and it satisfied the critics, and it launched on new hardware and sold over 1 million units. Look at all the game series that failed to reinvent themselves. For every Mega Man X, there are 10 Bomberman Act Zeros, Tomb Raider Angels of Darkness, and cel-shaded Princes of Persia. I think today we take it for granted, but this game series, the X series, did do an amazing job of modernizing the franchise in a way that is exciting and yet satisfies the classic traditions of the series. X1 did it all. If X1 was developed under a boulder-sized shadow of hype, then Mega Man X2 was developed under a mountain. By 1994, in addition to the X and Classic series, the cartoon show was on the air, and the fifth and debatably best Mega Man Game Boy game had came out earlier that year. Keiji Inafune, the Mega Man series' longtime creative force, stepped away from the art direction role for Mega Man X2, and he was more of a producer and writer, though he is credited with the decision to bring back Zero. The X-Hunters, 3 boss characters in the game, are based on concept art that was originally meant for Sigma in X1, but for X2, these original Sigma designs were fleshed out into their own characters. A fan art contest was considered for the designs of the Maverick robots, like how the classic series games had fans submit Robot Master designs, but ultimately they decided that they wanted the X series to be more surprising and less familiar. Being released on the Super Nintendo, X1 was a huge technological leap from the classic Mega Man series, and Capcom continued to push the technology forward. In X2, they developed a in-cartridge enhancement for the Super Nintendo called the CX4. The CX4 was used primarily to generate the 3D wireframe designs and the rotations, seen primarily in the game's introduction and the final boss fight. The effects were cutting edge at the time, and they're still cool to look at today. From the very beginning, you can see that the ambition of the team was to push the series forward. Now let's talk about the controls in the game. The controls here are pretty similar to X1. X can run left and right, and he doesn't accelerate or decelerate or slide to a stop, which is less dynamic than Mario or Sonic, but very controllable and precise. He shoots horizontally in the direction he's facing. X can also wall jump, and he sticks on walls and slides down, and these wall-based mechanics are incorporated much more in this game than in X1. In the start of the game, he has the ability to dash and to jump out of the dash. So right out of the gate, X feels very fast and controls very dynamically. There are some armor abilities and Maverick weapons that can really change how you control X in this game. Most notably, X can dash in the air once you get the dash boots. This makes him feel much more controllable and fast in the air. Also, once you get the arm part that allows you to charge up Maverick weapons, Flame Stag's weapon can be charged up and give you a second air dash. This combined with the other air dash really gives a lot of options in how you control X in the air. The way you control X's regular Buster's charge shot is much different once you have the arm part added to the armor. If you fully charge it, when you release it you'll get the first charged blast, but the supercharged shot does not automatically follow. X will glow, and then the next time you press the fire button, he'll release this supercharged shot. This is great because it allows you to time and aim when you use the supercharged blast. Overall, the controls here don't break or reinvent what X1 did, but there are a couple of great new additions that really change how X feels and makes him feel much more agile and strong. In previous Mega Man games, especially at the beginning of the game, the player character feels much more like an underdog, but in X2, he really feels strong and fast from the very beginning. Now let's talk about the level design of X2. While I discuss the level design, I will briefly mention story elements, and I'll go more in detail into the story later on. I just think they're worth mentioning as we go. Like X1, there is an intro level before you get to the Maverick selection screen, and there's a quick cutscene before you start the game, and I think it pairs well with the intro level. Quickly, we're informed that not much has changed. X is working to chase down the remaining Maverick robots, and the real battle is about to begin. There are some really cool wireframe graphics of X's helmet and the X from the title screen. Then you get to start the game, and we're off. X is riding up on a hover bike the first time we see him, and it appears that he has a companion riding along with him, and this companion is killed. I'll get more into this later, but it really does a lot to set the tone for the game right out of the gate. X ghost rides his hover bike into a giant robot, and then we're in control. Playing as X in X2, you can immediately slide, and all the enemies here go down pretty easily in this level. The level takes place in some sort of factory, and we can tell this by these cute robots that have screwdrivers for noses and the flying robots that are being assembled. There are collapsible walls that are coming down and trying to stop X from entering the factory, and he can easily blast through them. The game teaches us how to wall kick in a very clever way with the crushing wall. I like this because it looks cool, and skilled players won't be held up here like they would have been by the helicopters in X1. There's a huge robot that is the boss at the end of the level, and it's maybe the biggest robot we've seen in the series to this point, and yet this boss is a total pushover. 3 charge shots will bring it down. Again, it all comes together to make this feeling that X is no longer an underdog. Right out of the gate, you are very strong and fast. Thematically, X2's intro is very different than X1. In X1, you are fighting off robots that are invading a city, but in X2, you are the one invading the robot's territory. X is tearing this place apart. Rather than being weak or needing a companion to help him at the end of the level, in X2, the companion is unceremoniously destroyed. X is much tougher in this game, and he doesn't really need any help. It kind of feels like a lone wolf situation. After the intro, we get a quick cutscene, and again, I'll touch more on the story later, but the villains here say that those who underestimated X in the previous game are now scrap. This is a lot different than the intro of X1 where Vile is taunting X and Zero has to rescue him. The level select here is really well done. In my review of X1, I commented that my favorite setting for the level select was the world map setting, and someone at Capcom must have agreed because the world map setting is the only setting here, and it really gives this whole game a cool sense of place. The levels here are excellent. Each one does a good job of looking very distinct and feeling very different. Wheel Gator's level takes place inside of a giant tank that's bulldozing a city, and it's constantly bouncing, and you move around inside and outside of the tank. Bubble Crab's level is underwater, and you follow a giant robot fish that seems to be on security patrol. Again, this adds to a sense of place. These robots might be doing this even if X wasn't here, and you follow this giant fish into Bubble Crab's underwater base. Flame Stag's level has moments where you're inside of an erupting volcano and you get to ride a beetle. Overdrive Ostrich's level has a really cool moment where you ride these speeder bikes, and then a cutscene where X shoots down a launching rocket. Morph Moth and Magma Centipede and Spark Sponge have levels that aren't super distinct or have distinct gimmicks, though they still have little cool things like the security spotlights or the climate changing orbs, but these levels still have great platforming and cool secrets. Speaking of secrets, X2 has a ton of cool secrets. There are heart containers that expand X's health, E-tanks that can be charged and then used to heal X. There are armor parts that you can find that gives X different abilities, and they are all really fun to find, and some of them are hidden in some really clever locations, like the Leap of Faith in Crystal Snail's stage, or some that are hidden in passages in the roof of the level where you have to jump up and dash through the air to get to them. Those secrets in particular are a great example of X2's added emphasis on verticality and speed. From the very beginning, where you have to quickly wall kick up the crushing wall, there are a lot of moments where you either need to go up and or fast at the same time. Escaping the volcano or the crushing blocks in Magna Centipede's level are moments where the game feels very quickly paced. Crystal Snail's level has moments where you slide around very quick, and again, there's just a lot of moments where you're moving very fast and X is zipping across the screen. Bubble Crab's stage has water physics that are super exaggerated and allow you to jump very high, adding to the sense of verticality. There's just a lot of moments in the game where X is either required to speed up or things happen to him to make him speed up, or there are situations where again you have to go up quickly, and again the speed and verticality are really interesting in this game. Overall, X2's level design does a great job of feeling fresh and exciting. It's still primarily about running, jumping, and shooting, but they do a lot differently here. Many of the stages have unique gimmicks that caught my eye and made them unique stages amongst the series. There are tons of fun secrets, and I love how the levels encourage that, again, that added speed and verticality. Even after beating the classic 1 through 11 and X1, X2 still felt very fresh to me. Being a shooting platformer game, there are a lot of enemies to shoot in X2. The low-level enemies in X2 don't revolutionize anything, but they're still great fun. I like the visual designs of the dino tanks, or the warthog wheel robots, or the garbage robots that look like recycled robots from X1. Even though these three are easy to fight, the added visual style keeps things dynamic. I also really like the shield guys who throw frisbees. They reminded me of Sniper Joe. There are also lower level enemies that interact with the environment, like the robots who are actually pulling the crushing walls together, or the flying robots that light the natural gas pipes on fire. You can destroy them and stop whatever they're going to do to the environment. Also, there are these little alien looking robots that can attach themselves to X and change how he controls. Along with the lower level enemies, there are some great larger enemies and mid-bosses. There is the previously mentioned Beetle who can break apart walls in the levels and you can ride him. There is also a large fish robot that you can totally ignore or try to destroy. Crystal Snail's level has a great mid-boss that is a giant crystal that shoots out these pods that randomly move around and shoot bouncing beams at you. Magna Centipede's level has two mini-bosses, a giant ugly robot and a really cool wireframe sword. The wireframe sword still looks cool today, and I bet 3D effects were mind-blowing back in the 90s. Its movement is a little jarring and different, and so it feels very different to fight than some of the sprite-based fights from the previous games. Mid-bosses in this game are pretty hard. Moth's mini-boss has a cool cutscene where this little robot breaks out of what appears to be a test tube and then it goes into the garbage and takes control of a giant robot that was in the garbage. It's really cool, and it explains how later on when you bump into these little robots, they connect themselves to X and try to control him in the same way that this robot is controlling the garbage robot. These mid-bosses or larger enemies or whatever you would like to call them are really cool. They add dynamic things to the gameplay, they attack X in different ways, and all of them just look really cool, and they add a lot of value to the game overall. The Maverick boss fights in this game are great, and they're really my favorite boss fight collection in the Mega Man franchise to this point. They really were the star of the show for me. Like previous games, when you beat them, you earn these weapons from them, and those weapons will make certain bosses easier to destroy, but overall, they still felt harder than the bosses from previous games. Each one of them has something really cool that they bring to the table. I love how Wheel Gator hides in this blood-like oil substance. It's really intense. It's extreme when he comes out and he bites X. It almost feels horror-esque. Morph Moth is kind of a pushover, but there's multiple phases to him where he starts in a cocoon and then he becomes a moth, and I just felt like that was really creative. Overdrive Ostrich runs in the background and then he jumps into the battlefield, adding this larger scale to the fight that just made his fight really stand out in my mind. Flame Stag brings that verticality to the boss fights by dashing up and down the combat space. Magna Centipede is clearly somehow related to Boomer Kwanger because he can do a creepy disappear reappear thing, and X can cut off his tail if you use the right weapon during the fight. All of the bosses move around a lot, they do unique attacks. It doesn't seem like any of the Robot Master weapons can just totally slaughter any of these guys, except maybe Morph Moth. If you use the right weapon on him, he's pretty much a pushover. Also, Wire Sponge can be cut in half if you use the right weapon on him, and that's a really cool death animation. And then Crystal Snail, if you use the right weapon on him, it knocks his shell out. So again, there's just a lot of dynamic and cool things that these bosses do. There's a lot of character to them, and they're more challenging, which I really liked. At this point, having played through so many of these Mega Man games, it's fun to get a little bit more of a challenge. I can't fully discuss the game's bosses without mentioning the X-Hunters. At a certain point in the game, the X-Hunters will start to show up on the game's world map in between the levels. If you pick the level where the X-Hunter is and find the secret arena, you can fight them. When you return to the level select screen, the X-Hunters will move again. It's a really cool idea. I love how the world is truly interactive this time, and it's more than just a glorified menu. It gives you information that can really change how you play the game. Unfortunately for me, the X-Hunters will disappear for good if you beat a Maverick, or at least this is what I thought happened while I was playing. I wound up beating two of the Mavericks, the X-Hunters had disappeared, and there's only one left, so I did what I had to do to initiate the fight with that one. It was agile, it was a cool fight, and I really enjoyed it. There was some dialogue before you fought him, and he was very challenging and used a sword, kind of similar maybe to the Sigma fight in X1. When you beat him, you get a little bit more dialogue, and more importantly, you get a pieces of Zero's body. This is a really cool collectible item, and I still wound up loving this game without completing the X-Hunter fights, but this is a super unique idea, and it actually makes me want to go back and play the game again. After fighting the Mavericks, the world map will shift upwards and you get to see the Mavericks' secret base. Again, I love the use of the world map here and how it just adds to the sense of place and the sense of liveliness to the story. The Maverick Castle section of the game is really great. Each of the levels has a gimmick that the designers really lean into. My favorite is the first one. The crushing wall is back from the first level, but there's more than one crushing wall, and they're bigger, and there are some tricks into their design so that you have to dash back and forth across them while kicking up as fast as you can, and it really requires incredible speed and precision. It was a big challenge, maybe the biggest challenge I've faced to this point of my time playing through the Mega Man series, but I really enjoyed it. You get a cool boss fight with one of the X-Hunters. It's cool because the boss shoots out this bouncing ball that bounces around the room crazily, and he's kind of this big, scary looking robot, so it's just a fun, kind of high energy fight. The second level in the Maverick Castle has some underwater stages with some really tricky hovering walls and spikes. Again, you really have to hone in on your platforming skills, and as a late game challenge, and especially if you've played through the other Mega Man games, I think it's fun. I think it's really perfect that they crank up the challenge like this here at the end. The X-Hunter fight is crazy. It's a giant robot that hovers over spikes and has these other hovering platforms that Mega Man has to jump back and forth on, and you have to shoot these cannons on it till they all blow up, and then the scientist robot guy in there is exposed. It's a very hard fight, and once the scientist is exposed, he's very hard to actually land a hit on, or at least he was for me. Maybe I just suck at this fight, but it was probably my least favorite fight of the game, even though it's not in any way, a terrible fight like the turret room in Mega Man 2 or anything like that. Just probably my least favorite fight in the game. What is more interesting though is that when you beat him, he says something about a prophecy being fulfilled, which is very strange and kind of a subtle way of again letting us know that there's more lore in this series and more going on here than we know. The third Maverick Castle stage has these platforms that change direction every time X jumps on them, and there are some really tricky, almost puzzle-like elements where you need to get this platform to go up the stage without letting the enemies blast X off of them and without getting them stuck up against walls. All three of these late game gimmicks the crushing wall, the moving walls underwater, and these directional platforms are great. Again, I think the super challenge is great here at the end, and there's really a unique platforming challenge here at the end of this game. The third Maverick stage also has potentially the best secret in the game, and maybe even the best secret in the Mega Man series to this point. If you can figure it out, you can get Ryu's Shoryuken attack from Street Fighter, but be warned, this is a crazy challenge. You will need the armor that lets you air dash and the armor that will allow you to supercharge your blaster. You can find a hidden ladder and get up into this little room that is super duper tricky. You can get to the ladder by turning one of these bat robots into an ice cube, and once you get up there, you're gonna have to dash your way down from a platform through this narrow section of spikes. If you go too far, you'll die. If you don't go far enough, you'll die. I died over and over and over just getting past the first part. Then once you get past the first part, you have to jump out into this area of spikes, dash forward, let X fall, then dash backwards. And then when I finally did do that, you know, you get into this area where you fall downwards and you want to slide along the wall because there's a hidden room. And when I got to that hidden room, there was no Shoryuken because you actually have to be at full health when you begin sliding down the wall. It is a crazy secret, but I think it's worth it. I think the Shoryuken is super fun to use, super cool to look at. This is the kind of secret that, especially in the 90s, when you put something like this in a game that is so obscure, like who would think to make sure that they had full health once they got to this point, and then even if they could find the room, there's a lot to this. Like, I think that Capcom put this secret in there out of love. It's kind of a way of Capcom saying, I see you, if you made it to this point, if you find this, thanks for playing our game, thanks for going this far. And I just really appreciate this kind of secret. I really just appreciate this kind of just pat on the back to players who really invest the time to play the game. The next level brings back the classic boss rush, where you can pick the order in which you want to refight the Maverick robots. And I missed this because this wasn't in X1, and I'm glad they brought this back from the classic series for this game. I feel like the end of Mega Man boss rush is just kind of iconic and classic at this point, and I'm glad it was here. When you finally beat all of the Robot Masters, Sigma talks to X, either telepathically or over a loudspeaker. I don't really know how X can hear him, but they talk, which brings back that iconic trope of the main villain of the series always being the main villain. In the classic series, there's some fake outs that make you think maybe Dr. Wily's not behind it all, and then he is. Well, here we are in X2. Sigma is like the Wily of this series. We may have thought that the X-Hunters were behind it all or whatever, but here it is, Sigma's the guy, and I like this trope. I think it's kind of fun. The castle explodes, and when you return to it on the world map, it's destroyed, which again is just another great way of using the world map, adding these extra details that really make this feel like a world that X is interacting with. The last Sigma stage looks a lot like Magna Centipede stage and that room where the X-Hunters are talking in the cutscenes, which is fine. It's not really bad, but I think maybe it would have been better just to do something more straightforward and simple, like that final level at the end of X1 where you just kick up that tube to get to Sigma. You reach the boss room, and there is Sigma. There he is again, and he's as intimidating and kind of crazy looking as ever. He gives some dialogue, and then the real climax of the story, Zero, comes back. And this is a really impactful moment. Zero is the epic hero who sacrificed himself to save X at the end of X1, but now he's on Sigma's side, and that's a lot. And he attacks X, and this fight is super intense. Zero moves crazy fast. He can be all over the stage really quickly. I kicked up the wall to avoid him, and Zero comes in and he slams the ground and he kicks up these rocks. And so to dodge these rocks, you have to time your jump off the wall and air dash just right to get to the ground. And then on the ground, Zero can shoot at you with these like 3 sequence blasts, and he has a shield pose that makes him invulnerable. So you have to perfectly time your air dashes off the wall, perfectly time your shots to hit him, and then he can slide with his sword, and if he gets you, he'll slam X up against the wall. He destroys the ground when he starts fighting. The fight's just very visceral. There's this different music that kicks in right at the start of the fight, and right out of the gate it just feels super intense and climactic, and it's really a difficult fight, and I died a lot, but it's easy to get back to this fight, so dying a lot doesn't feel frustrating. It just feels like a good challenge. Overall, this might be my favorite boss fight in the entire Mega Man franchise to this point. It's super challenging, it's fun, it's fast-paced, the music is epic, and thematically it's very impactful. It almost feels like this big epic shonen anime fight. It's just super cool. When you beat him, the dialogue reveals that Zero is kind of out of it and has maybe a bad memory going on, and he's injured. You feel kind of bad for him. It really sucks to see him in this state, and he kind of stumbles back and he's injured, but he punches a hole in the floor so that you can go after Sigma. And I do kind of really emotionally connect with these games at certain moments, and this made me really feel like Sigma's a jerk. Like, this is my friend, and I want to go after him and end this game right. You fall down this hole, which is this huge, gigantic hole that really kind of sets the stage for this epic confrontation with Sigma, and you talk with him and begin the fight. The first phase is similar to the lightsaber phase in X1, but this time he has a Wolverine claw. It's pretty fun, and he's fast-paced and a challenge, but it's pretty mellow compared to the Zero fight that just happened. After this, you get to his final phase, where he transforms into a wireframe version of his head. I think it's like a computer virus. This is really cool and displays those simple 3D graphics that this specific Super Nintendo cartridge could do. This is a kind of weird fight because Sigma is spawning lower level enemies. It's not particularly difficult, but I liked the novelty of it, and it just kind of feels maybe even a little bit creepy. The Sigma wireframe head is cool. It changes different colors and rotates, and the mouth moves. And again, it's very simple, but I think it's cool, especially if you imagine that you were playing this in the 90s and any type of 3D animation was mind-blowing back then. It's really cool. When you beat him, he says that defeating him will only make him stronger, but then he cryptically complains that there's something wrong with Zero, and that there's something about him being one of the Doctor's creations. Again, this is something that adds more lore and more mystery to the series, and I liked it. You get a final cutscene where it shows the sky, and then it shows Zero and X watching a sunrise, and it's cool to see them kind of united again. Then X is riding on a hover bike on the highway, and then you get a thanks for playing scene with the Capcom logo, and Zero in my playthrough was looking really cool with a dark armor on. Overall, it's a pretty cool ending. It's not particularly flashy, but I did like it, and I liked the song that played while X was riding the hover bike. Now, pivoting back to just kind of sum up the whole storyline, I'll say that the storyline in X2 is similar to the storyline in X1, in that it kind of takes a less is more approach. There isn't a bunch of long cutscenes or long stretches of dialogue, but what's here is intentional and very interesting. My favorite aspect of the story is how it kind of flips the coin on X1's story. As I stated before, this game begins with X attacking the enemies rather than the enemies attacking the city at the beginning of X1, and X's companion dies unceremoniously at the beginning of this game, in contrast to Zero's dramatic self-sacrifice at the end of the first X game. In the beginning of X1, Vile taunted X, but now here at the beginning of X2, we have these cutscenes where the X-Hunters are calling X formidable. There's a really cool story here that it feels kind of dark. We also briefly see Dr. Kane in a cutscene, and this little simple interaction with Dr. Kane, along with the green guy who gets blown up, really actually changed the tone of the story for me. There are other people who are X's friends, but in this game, X is really alone. It made me feel that X was even more alone. than he was in the first X game, and it made it that much better when we finally got to unite with Zero at the end of the game. Also, there's a real sense of place here. There's just little details like the scrap robot being made out of the robots from X1, going to a level that looks like the room where the X-Hunters meet, or the giant fish robot that's patrolling the sea that it makes it feel like X is following him and sneaking into the fortress. There's just a lot of things that really make this world feel inhabited, and again, moving around the world map, it just makes things just feel exciting and like there's a lot going on in this story. Now, I've got to mention before I finish this review my personal nostalgia or bias towards this game. This was actually the first Mega Man game I ever played. I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. I had a friend over. There was a grocery store near where I lived where you could rent Super Nintendo games, and me and this friend, I don't remember the details obviously because I was 4 or 5, but my mom let me and this friend rent a game, and we picked Mega Man X2, and I vividly remember my friend playing the game first and getting crushed by the crushing wall at the start of the game. It really freaked me out. I was really captivated by the game, but I just couldn't imagine how a game could have something so challenging and so scary right out of the gate at the beginning of the game. And I just watched my friend play. I didn't really ask for a turn. I think he did get past the first level eventually, and then when I was playing the game, I just played around in the password screen. I would just let the game sit there until it would show me the little demo or the intro cutscene over and over again. I was very intimidated but fascinated by this game, and I think I did rent it once or twice and go a little bit further in it, maybe getting past the first level, but then I didn't play that game at all until now when I'm playing X2 to review it. And it's amazing how much those little things just stick out in my memory about this game. And I've got to be honest, my nostalgia and kind of warm fuzzy feelings towards playing games when I was younger really does add value to the game for me, though I do think people would still find a lot to appreciate about this game even if they don't have any nostalgic feelings towards it. Now, considering the music of Mega Man X2, I want to say that it's great. I really enjoyed it. If X1 had maybe a power metal or thrash metal vibe, I'd say that X2 is very similar with a little bit of a almost prog metal influence in there. There are a lot of unique tones in this game's music, like maybe a saxophone-like tone in Wheel Gator's level, and then some more traditional synth tones. There's also some eerie tracks, like the music that was played during the cutscenes. A lot of the tracks still rock out, kind of like Mega Man X, but there's also some that have almost more emotional, maybe uplifting feelings, like the song in Overdrive Ostrich's level. The music here is just really awesome overall. There are some kind of weird track placements at the end, you know, playing music that I had heard before in the game and then playing it at the end. But they also saved the Zero song for the Zero fight at the end, and that song is just totally awesome. So overall, I love the music in this game. I would say the soundtrack in its own way is just as good as X1. It's just an awesome soundtrack. So overall, I gotta say that X2 is a 10 out of 10 certified classic awesome game. Even if you don't like Mega Man games, even if you don't like action 2D platformers, I think there's a lot to like about this game. Incredible art direction, incredible music, a cool storyline. If you do love games, there's just so much challenge here, there's so many secrets, there's so much fun stuff here. If you're not very good at games, there's the options of picking the different levels and exploring them, and a lot of fun to be had even if you didn't complete the game. If you are really good at games, this game has some great late game challenges and again, a lot of secrets and fun stuff to do. So overall, X2 is awesome, one of the best. I just want to say thanks to everyone. I appreciate all of the likes and comments and subscribes that I've gotten. I'd love to hear your guys' opinion about X2. Do you guys think I'm blowing smoke? Do you guys agree with me? Or somewhere in the middle? Let me know. Thanks again, and have a great day.